One of the significant developments for the life of the Episcopal Church was the development of the full communion agreement with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. It's important to see this agreement as part of a culmination of an ongoing ecumenical conversation that Episcopalians and other Anglicans have been having from the end of the 19th century. So the Episcopal Church is already in full communion with other bodies. A good example is the full communion arrangement between the Episcopal Church of the Philippines and the Independent Church of the Philippines. More closer at home with Lutheranism, there's something called the Porvoo Agreement, which is a full communion agreement between the Church of England with Scandinavian Lutheran churches. So the Lutheran Church in Norway and Sweden. Those churches had maintained an apostolic succession of bishops, and that Porvoo Agreement really laid the foundation for thinking about full communion with other Lutheran bodies. As well, there's been a dialogue between Anglicans and Roman Catholics that started in 1968 in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. I personally am a member of the dialogue body between the Episcopal Church and the United States Council of Catholic Bishops. So ecumenism and moving towards expressions of full visible communion is an important aspect of contemporary Anglicanism. We can also look in the canons and see the other bodies that we exist in full communion relationships with. The full communion agreement with the Moravian churches of North America was also an important precedent here. So in 1999, in the year 2000, a document called Call to Common Mission was approved by the Episcopal Church and the ELCA and their respective church conventions. This establishes full intercommunion between these bodies. Foundational to that is a recognition of each other's doctrinal statements. So what that means is that the Episcopal Church, for instance, recognizes the Augsburg Confession as a valid and authentic doctrinal statement. In turn, the ELCA accepted apostolic succession in the ways in which the Episcopal Church recognized that, with the sense from the Episcopal Church that not all ministers in the ELCA were yet in apostolic succession, even if they were ordained by a Lutheran bishop. So what this means is the Episcopal Church recognized ELCA ministers that were not ordained by Lutheran bishops in apostolic succession. This is in paragraph 8, with the hope that eventually all orders would fall under an apostolic succession. These agreements are very similar to what was worked out between the Anglican Church of Canada and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada a few years prior. What this does is produce some shifts in how both bodies recognize the nature of the church. And so the church is made up of multiple communions and not simply overlapping or national churches. So the Episcopal Church, in a way, isn't simply the Episcopal Church in the United States of America. It is also a communion in relationship with another communion, the ELCA. The focus of the work of being called to common mission is a focus on the common mission of all the baptized, which, as we saw, is a core Lutheran idea, and as we saw in looking at Canon 3 of the Canons of the Episcopal Church, a core idea for the Episcopal Church. And also an insight that the role of bishops can be negotiated for the purpose of Christian unity. That is, as we looked at the fourth article of the Chicago-Lambeth Quadrilateral, that the importance for reunion of churches is that there's a recognition of the historic episcopate as locally adapted. And so a recognition that, well, the Lutheran Church will be exercising the historic episcopate in ways that are slightly different than how Episcopalians do it, and that difference can be negotiated, and both expressions can be seen as authentic expressions of episcopacy. And so that means that Episcopalians then had to grapple with differences in Lutheran ecclesiology and be able to affirm and receive those differences as authentic expressions of ways of being church that don't hinder a fully shared common life, that both then are apostolically authentic. There's other differences that were grappled with. The ELCA has a different understanding of the diaconate, so there's a tendency for them not to serve in a parish context or for there to be a transitional state in the way to ordination, but rather diaconate is a set-aside role for ministry that only really emerged in the ELCA in the 1980s as a distinct order of ministry. Lutherans have a different kind of sacramental piety than some Episcopalians. Lutherans won't practice something like Eucharistic reservation. All the bread and wine is consumed at the Eucharist. There is rarely will you see veneration of altars or veneration of crosses or any of some of the fuller ritual gestures that you find in the Episcopal Church. There is a real challenge then that Episcopalians have to deal with from Lutheran ecclesiology. Episcopalians ask Lutherans to have their bishops, when they're ordained, be ordained in part by an Episcopalian bishop to be present, so that eventually all Lutheran bishops fall into an order of apostolic succession. And Lutherans didn't fully see the internal logic or necessity of that. They were persuaded that it was necessary for full communion. But some of that resistance from Lutherans really caused Episcopalians to need to articulate their assumptions more clearly as a result. Lutherans, on their own part, often were wary of the sense of little liturgical flexibility on the part of the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church insists on really thorough observance of the rubrics of the Book of Common Prayer, for instance, whereas Lutherans thought there ought to be a little bit more flexibility in worship. Now, prayer books are not exchanged, but Lutherans are aware that if they perform an Episcopal Church service, that they do need to follow the rubrics thoroughly and carefully. Also, Lutherans were a little puzzled on the degree to which the authority of bishops is emphasized in the Episcopal Church. And Lutherans had a sense that episcopacy could be exercised in ways that emphasized a more shared model of authority throughout the church. There's also not the same sense of being a bishop for life in the Lutheran Church. One can retire from being a bishop and cease functioning as a bishop upon ending one's role in that office. Whereas in the Episcopal Church, as we saw in the canons, a bishop is a bishop forever, and they just keep on acting as a bishop really until the day they die. I hope that gives you a sense of what call to common mission is, how full communion operates in between the two bodies, and some of the challenges that this reveals for how we understand what church is and how that might force us to re-examine some of our collective assumptions. All right, I look forward to discussing this with you in class.